So thank you very much, Bernard and Eleftheria, for organizing this amazing seminar series. I'm really glad to present this paper, which is still a working paper, still a work in progress. So feel free to add comments, provide suggestions. At this stage, they are very useful. And this is a paper on data brokers, co-authored with Yiquan from Liverpool and Carlo Reggiani from Manchester. And it is a paper on data brokers. So far, this seminar series has mainly considered two major aspects. On the one hand, it has focused on the privacy dimension, asking the question, how do consumers share or disclose information? On the other hand, this seminar series has also focused on how firms exploit data in the form, for instance, of price discrimination and possibly anti-competitive conduct. And typically these firms collect data themselves, or they buy data from other parties, third parties, or data brokers. And data brokers are the focus of this presentation. They operate in a very shady environment. We really know little about their activity. So there is a very important report that was published in 2014 by the US Federal Trade Commission that to some extent uncovers some of the aspects related to their activity. Still, however, we do not know how they operate in the contractual agreements with firms. And what we know, for instance, is that data brokers collect information from local governments. This kind of data collection is somewhat effortless. They also collect data from other companies, stores, websites, and more importantly, for this paper, they also share data with other data brokers. And this is going to be the focus of the paper. We are going to look at how and when data brokers have incentive to share data with one another. And looking at the market for data from the data broker's perspective is also very important, because this market is growing a lot. It's an industry that nowadays worth 200 billion. And we know that very small piece of information, like an email address, can be very remunerative for them. The present discount value of an email address is $89, and there is quite a bit of heterogeneity across sectors. For instance, this email address can be worth $251 in the travel industry and $84 in the retail industry. And these data brokers, if we want to define their activities and who they are, these data brokers are companies whose primary business is data collection. They collect data, aggregate data, analyze data, and then sell data to other parties. And they differentiate themselves from the attention brokers like Facebook, Amazon, and others whose primary business is not data collection. They collect data, but for other purposes. Facebook has a social network, and Google has a search engine. And what we know also about this sector is that it's fairly concentrated. So there are 4,000 data brokers worldwide, but the most important are really a few data brokers like Axiom, who's focusing on transactions, and CoreLogic, which is focusing instead on property and financial information. So this is to say that data brokers operate in a very important market. And with this paper, we would like to present a model in which we study how do data brokers compete. And they compete to sell a product, which is a bit different from the typical products that typical firms trade. In this case, the special product is data, and data is different from traditional products because of some properties. First of all, there is uncertainty regarding the value of data. There are some other properties like excludability and non-rivalry, although in some cases you can have a partial non-rivalry and partial excludability. But more important for the focus of this paper, they have a contextual value. The same data set sold to different buyers can have a different value. And on the basis of this, you can have complementarities and substitutability with other data that have already been collected by data brokers or other parties. And also, when you use data or you want to use data along with other data that you might have, you need to combine data. And combining data sources can sometimes be very costly. And all the empirical guys in this virtual room know that it can be a bit demanding in some cases. So in this paper, we provide this model of data broker competition, and we study also the following question. Why do data brokers share data in some markets and compete in some other? This is also important because the Federal Trade Commission report on data brokerage shows that 7 out of 9 data brokers were collecting information, and they were also sharing information with others. And this can seem a bit weird at some point because, to some extent, these create less substitutability across data brokers. And the answer that we find with this paper is that the action, the idea, the strategy of competing in the market rather than sharing information with rival depend pretty much on the properties of the data structure. And in practice, this depends on whether data sets can eventually create complementarities or substitutability. In particular, we showed that there is an incentive to share data with another data broker that can be non-monotonic in the net value of the merged data. In practice, we show that when there exist complementarities between a different type of data sets or economies of scope, the general idea is that the data brokers might prefer to compete in the market. On the other hand, when you have a substitutability, diminishing returns, you may have an incentive as a data broker to share data with your rival. However, this incentive will depend on the dimension of the merging cost that a buyer or the data brokers might face. And in practice, this sharing agreement will emerge as a tool to soften market competition. Now, let me say a few things regarding the literature that we contribute to. We contribute to the recent literature on competition and the market for data. There are 2 very nice papers that are quite recent, Bergman and Bonatti, and a paper from Shota Ihiashi that are that focus on these intermediaries, the data brokers. But also our paper contributes to the marketing literature on data that was started in the 2000 with some papers by Miklos Sarvari and co-authors that focus on consultancies and how consultancy can sell data, can sell reports, and when depending also on whether these reports are accurate or they have correlation with the information provided in other reports. And to some extent, we also contribute to the literature on data sales and the downstream competition. And this literature normally focuses on the strategies of a data broker, a unique data broker that has to sell data to downstream firms. And the strategies that this data broker can put forward are the following: either selling this data exclusively or selling this data non-exclusively to downstream competitors. And what we do also, we contribute to the literature on big data, privacy, and competition, and some of the papers that have been presented in this seminar series. But in the mechanism that we provide, especially regarding the complementarities and substitutability between data sets, we also contribute to the literature on patent licensing and patent pooling. And we also have some similarities with the literature on complementary products and bundling. Now, let me go to the main part of the paper, which is the model. Are there questions so far? No? Okay. So we have an economy in which you have 2 data brokers, data broker K1 and K2, and there is a client firm. In the economy, there are end consumers, And these end consumers can be characterized by M attributes. These attributes can be the browsing history, the email address, health conditions of the end consumers. And therefore, we can identify, we can construct a matrix lambda k, which is composed by M rows and N columns, an M by N logical matrix. The cells of this logical matrix will have a value 0 or 1, depending on whether that data broker has information regarding that specific consumers on that specific attribute I. And therefore, we can use a function f that can map these logical matrices to real numbers. And this function f will play a very important role in our model, because this function f will measure the extra profits that the firm can generate by using data. So suppose that you are a supermarket and you are buying data from a data broker, then, and you are making a certain amount of profits, then if you buy data from data brokers, this function f will measure the extent, it will measure the extra profits that any data-related activity, like data-driven management, price discrimination, marketing, or advertising, can generate. And for the sake of simplicity in this presentation, we will also assume that data broker 2 will provide weekly more valuable information to the buyer than data broker 1. Strictly speaking, this will imply that the function of lambda 2 will be at least as equal as the function of lambda 1. So if you are a supermarket, to some extent, this data broker can provide you with better or slightly better information than data broker 1. There are two other assumptions that we make. So data brokers are already endowed with data, so they do not engage in strategic data collection, and they can follow two strategies. On the one hand, they can compete to sell independently their data to the buyer. On the other hand, they can share data and produce a consolidated report. When they share data for that specific market, for that specific firm, they will behave as a unique entity. And these profits will then be shared. But this does not imply that there is a merger. This does not imply that they are a unique entity. They will behave for that specific market as a unique entity. Now, let me introduce an important aspect of this presentation and of this model, which is the data structure. We will define as the ex-ante data structure the following. So if two data sets, suppose that you are a buyer and you acquire two different data sets from two different data brokers. If you merge these data sets, you might have complementarities or substitutability. We will identify with the ex-ante data structure the potential result, the potential value that you obtain when you merge two different data sets. In particular, we will define as a superadditive data structure the following: the value of the merged data set, f lambda k or lambda minus k. We will have a superadditive data structure if the value of the merged data set is larger or equal than the sum of the values of the two data sets sold independently. That is when you have complementarities. In particular, suppose that you have a data broker 1 that has information regarding 4 consumers on 2 attributes, browsing history. And then you have a data broker 2 that has information on the same 4 consumers on 2 different attributes, email addresses. When you merge the 2 data sets, you will have a final data set that will provide you with a larger value than the sum of the 2 data sets sold independently. Indeed, you will have some complementarities. You will have some economies of scale, of scope. The other alternative is that you have a subadditive data structure. When you have a subadditive data structure, the value of the merged data set is lower than the value coming from the sum of the two data sets sold independently. In practice, this implies that you have some substitutability. How can you measure this? You can imagine a situation in which data broker 1 has the same information provided by data broker 2. Or alternatively, you have some forms of correlation. For instance, there is one data broker that has information regarding income, and there is another data broker that has information regarding education. And in turn, you might end up with results that are substitutable to some extent. You can also imagine a situation in which you have a decreasing returns to scale, and we know that in the data market, this is quite often the case, as shown by two very nice papers by Clausen and Courters and Schaffer and Courters. You can also have a very extreme case of subadditivity that arises when merging two data sets can destroy some value. You can have a situation, for instance, that can arise when you have two data sets that when merged can identify some mismatch, some inaccuracy, or these merging costs are very high, such that you are destroying some value. Now, with this in mind, and with the potential data structure in mind, we can identify the payoff of the data broker and the buyer in the two subgames that we will consider. First of all, let us consider the case in which there is competition. If there is competition, data broker profits will be equal to pi k, and this pi k will be equal to 0 whether the buyer, the downstream buyer, the unique buyer in the downstream market is not acquiring data broker k data. However, if the buyer is acquiring data from that data broker, the data broker will get a price pk, and pk will be the endogenous price set by the data broker. The buyer instead, when there is competition, will get pi 0, which are the profits obtained when this firm is not engaging in any data-driven activity. But then, because this buyer will acquire data, we will have two cases. In the first case, that the buyer is acquiring only one data set. And if the buyer, the firm, is buying data from data broker K, it will increase its profits by f lambda K, and it will need to pay a price pk. There can also be a case in which the buyer decides to acquire data from both data brokers. In this case, it needs to pay a price pk and a price p minus k. The two data sets will be sent to the buyer. The buyer will need to merge the data set at a cost cb, and in turn, it will get this f lambda k or lambda minus k. So this is the extra value that will come from the merge between data broker K's data and data broker minus K data. You can see now that because of this merging cost, the ex ante value that you can get can eventually be destroyed. And this will play a very important role in 2 slides. Now, this is when data brokers are competing. Suppose now the data brokers are sharing data in this market. If data brokers are sharing data in this market, they will jointly set a price P. They will merge the two data sets at the upstream cost C, and the joint profits will be then shared according to this sharing rule. This is the share of profits that will go to data broker K, and the sharing rule in this case will be a proportional sharing rule. So the value of data broker's K data as compared to the total value in the economy. We use also other sharing rules like a sharing rule that implements a Shapley value, and we find that the results are identical, but we can also use additional sharing rules. The results will be the same. If there is a sharing, the buyer will obtain profits equal to pi 0, which are the profits that the buyer obtains when there is no data-driven activity. It will benefit from the value generated by the merged data set. It will need to pay a price P to the data brokers. We can now present the ex-post data structure. Remember, as I was defining a few slides ago, you can have complementarities and substitutability when you merge dataset. However, when you merge dataset, you need to incur the merging cost. And this merging cost can be an upstream merging cost if the combination of the two datasets is occurring at the upstream level between data brokers, or this can happen when the buyer decides to merge the datasets on its own at a cost CB. So for ex-post data structure, we will define the net value of the merged dataset. And in particular, we will have three scenarios here. In the first case, the data structure will be ex-post superadditive. If the data structure is ex-post superadditive for the buyer and the data brokers, this implies that the net value of the merged dataset that takes into account the value of the merged dataset, the ex-ante value net of the merging cost, needs to be larger than the sum of the values of the two datasets sold independently. Clearly, this situation can only occur if and only if the ex-ante data structure is already superadditive. So to some extent, you have some complementarities that are very strong and the merging costs are sufficiently small. You can also have a situation in which the ex-post data structure is subadditive for the buyer and for the data brokers. In this case, the net value of the merged dataset is lower than the sum of the values of the two datasets sold independently. Clearly, you can have this case in two scenarios, when either the ex-ante data structure features some complementarities, so the ex-ante data structure is already superadditive, but you have very high merging cost, or the ex-ante data structure is subadditive and the merging costs are very small. The third case is the case that we define the ex-post extreme subadditive case that emerges when the net value of the merged dataset is smaller than the maximum value of the two datasets. So this arises when, regardless of the ex-ante data structure, you have some very large merging cost. Now, with this in mind, we can go
Leonardo,
to the
we have a very quick clarifying question from Lawrence White. Are the merging costs different if the buyer does it or the brokers do it?
Yes, we assume that the buyer has merging costs CB that are different from the merging costs occurring upstream, that are the merging costs for the data brokers that are C. At the moment, we do not rank them, but they will play a very important role. So we will have two cases. One case in which you have the downstream merging cost larger than the upstream merging cost. And you can imagine a situation in which you are a supermarket, you are not very good in entering data because your activity is to sell some goods. And in this case, the merging costs of the data brokers are smaller. Data brokers are more efficient because they do this job on a daily basis as compared to a supermarket. But you can also have a situation in which the upstream merging costs are larger than the downstream merging costs. C is larger than CB. And you can imagine in this case, a situation in which the data brokers are selling data to Facebook, and Facebook is very good in handling data. And so it can be more efficient than data brokers. So we have the two scenarios in our paper as well. Any other question? Great, so I continue. So the timing of the game will be as follows. In the first stage of the game, the buyer will the data brokers will simultaneously and independently decide whether or not to share their data. And they will share data if and only if this is good for both data brokers. This implies that data brokers will verify, according to the sharing rule, whether their individual profits that take into account the share of the profits that they obtain under sharing are larger than the profits that they would otherwise obtain under competition. Given this outcome, there will be the pricing decision. If there is sharing, data brokers will jointly set a price for the data set. And otherwise, if there is competition, they simultaneously and independently set a price for their own data set. Finally, the buyer will decide whether to acquire the data or not, and the equilibrium concept is a top-game perfect Nash equilibrium, and as usual, we solve it by backward induction. Now, let us first consider the case in which you have competition. And let's consider the case in which you have a superadditivity at both levels. So this implies that you have some complementarities stemming from the presence of two different data sets when you combine them. And the data brokers in this case can follow two strategies. They can sell their data set alone, which implies the fact that the maximum price they would set is equal to their intrinsic value of the data set. For instance, data broker K will be able to set a price at the maximum price that will be able to set when selling alone will be equal to F lambda K. Otherwise, the buyer will not have any incentive to spend more to have something that is less valuable. Or alternatively, because there are some complementarities, the data brokers can try to sell their data set when also the other data broker is selling the data set. To some extent, they will try to benefit from the externalities that data brokers can obtain when selling together the data set and having the buyer to merge them. So they can try to benefit from these positive externalities, which can imply they can even set a higher price than the one that is equal to their intrinsic value. And in this case, what happens in equilibrium is that the buyer is induced to acquire both data sets. Data brokers will try to find a way to sell their data sets together, that they will set the price that they will set is a price such that P1 star plus P2 star will be equal to the entire value of the merged data set minus the merging cost. Strictly speaking, there will be a multiplicity of equilibrium such that both buyers will sell data. They will discount the fact that the buyer will need to merge the data sets on its own. This downstream inefficiency will be passed upstream into prices, and therefore both data sets will be able to sell the data set. And in particular, in this multiplicity of equilibrium, the price that each data broker will set will belong to the following interval. They will set a price that can be at least equal to their intrinsic value, how much they will create in terms of value to the buyer when selling alone, but this price can also be increased up to the following upper bound. And this upper bound measure the data broker K net marginal contribution to the marginal data, to the entire data set. In practice, data brokers can set a price that takes into account the fact that there are some externalities in the economy, because the buyer is acquiring both data sets, and can increase its price up to the point that internalize its net marginal contribution to the entire data set. And their net marginal contribution is much larger because of the externalities of their intrinsic contribution to the data set. So to see this graphically, these are the best response function. This is the continuum of equilibria. And you can see that this equilibrium the prices will belong to this continuum, and they will be able to set a price such that the minimum price that they can set is equal to their intrinsic value, but this price can go up to the point in which they internalize the externalities that the superadditivity data structure creates, and therefore they can set a price up to the net marginal contribution. Now, important point here, complementarity creates conditions for a multiplicity of equilibria, and they can set a price even larger than the intrinsic net contribution to the buyer. Suppose now you have subadditivity. When you have subadditivity, the mechanisms are similar, but you cannot benefit anymore from the presence of positive externalities. If the data structure is subadditive, it implies that either you have some degree of overlaps between data sets, and therefore both data brokers are selling the same type of data set to some extent, or downstream merging costs are very large, such that some value can disappear. So this implies that data brokers will start compete more aggressively to sell their data set. And again, they will try to sell their data set alone, but the price will be very large, or they will try to sell their data set when also the other data brokers is selling the data set as well. This implies that in order to induce the buyer to acquire the data set, they will need to discount the overlapping component, because if the buyer is already acquiring the data set from the rival, you need to make sure as a data broker that the buyer is also acquiring from you, so you will need to set a lower price. And at the same time, if you assume that the buyer is already acquiring data from the other data broker, you need to discount the fact that the buyer will need to incur in some merging cost CB. So each data broker will compete very aggressively. They will discount the downstream merging cost. They will discount also the overlapping component, and the final price will be equal to the net marginal contribution to the merged data set. This is a price that is very similar to the one that we have seen before in this case, but in this case, the net marginal contribution is larger than the intrinsic value because you have externalities. In this case, the net marginal contribution is lower than the value generated by each data broker alone. To see it graphically, both data brokers will be able to sell the data set, and the price will be equal to the net marginal contribution to the merged data set. You can see that data broker 2 is setting a price that is lower than its intrinsic contribution. Data broker 1 is setting a price that is lower than its intrinsic contribution. So this implies that the buyer will have some benefit. There will be some surplus left over for the buyer because of this intensive competition, and because both data brokers will be discounting the overlapping component of the data set, and they will also be discounting the merging cost. There is a final case to be analyzed when we consider competition, which is when merging costs are very large. And because merging costs are very large, you can have a destruction of value. And indeed, what happens in this case, there is no point for a rational buyer to acquire two data sets, because merging them will lead to a destruction of value. So what will happen is that you have a sort of Bertrand competition with asymmetric quality. Prices will go down up to the point in which data broker 1 will set the price to 0, and data broker 2 will set a price equal to the difference in the value that we have created, that the data set creates alone. And remember that at the very beginning, we assumed that data broker 2 can provide the buyer with a weakly better value than data broker 1. So if they are very asymmetric, so data broker 2 is very specialized in that specific segment, to some extent data broker 2 can still make some good profits. Otherwise, this will tend to 0. But what is important in this case is that only data broker 2 will be able to sell data. Data broker 1 even with the price of 0 or with any price, will not be able to sell data. So just to sum up, when we have competition, we have three cases. If you have super additive data structure such that the value of the merged data set is at least as large as the value of the two data sets sold independently, you will have a multiplicity of equilibria that our brokers will be able to gather to extract all the surplus from the buyer, but they will need to grant a discount regarding the merging cost, because they benefit from the presence that both data brokers are selling data, and they need to induce the buyer to acquire both data sets. If you have an exposed subadditive data structure, there will be a unique Nash equilibrium, and each data broker will set a very low price equal to their net marginal contribution to the entire data set. Again, here, there will be a discount that accounts for the merging cost occurring downstream, but also there will be a discount for the overlapping component of the data set. And this implies that the buyer will have some surplus. And finally, there is a case in which the downstream data structure is exposed to extreme subadditive. So the merging costs are very large. There is a potential for destruction of value. And indeed, the buyer only acquires data from data broker 2. The price the data broker 2 is setting is equal to the difference in the value created by the two data brokers, and data broker 1 is setting a price equal to 0. In terms of surplus accruing to the buyer, we can see that somewhat paradoxically, the buyer would rather prefer to have redundant, imperfect, or less powerful information than more powerful information in which you have complementarity. And this is because in this area, you have extreme subadditivity, competition is very intense, and the buyer is benefiting from this intense competition, even though he's buying a data set only from data broker 2. In this area, this is the area in which there is a subadditive data structure. There is a very intense competition, but not as intense as in this area. Both data brokers are selling data, and each data broker is setting a price equal to its net marginal contribution to the merged data set. And finally, in this area here, there is no value, there is no surplus for the buyer, because data brokers, when there is a super additive data structure, are able to internalize everything. Of course, in a situation in which under competition, you have a multiplicity of equilibria. So any questions so far? Okay, so let's consider now the other subgame when there is data sharing. When the data sharing exists, is chosen, the type of pricing strategy is very simple as compared to before. In particular, they will behave, the data brokers will behave as a unique entity. So this implies that we'll set a price that when the data structure is exposed to subadditive or superadditive, then the data broker will be able to extract everything from the buyer. So they will set a price that is equal to the value of the merged data set. However, the joint profits will be now equal to the price f lambda 1, lambda 2, but because they need to the shared data and the merged data on their own, they will need to incur this upstream merging cost. This is very simple. But now, let us consider when the data structure is exposed to extreme subadditive for both. So this implies that if they share data, there will be a destruction of value. So data broker 2 will have an incentive to share data with data broker 1 that under competition will get nothing. But they will have an incentive to share data, but not to use data broker 1 data. Because if they merge the two data sets together at a cost C, C will be so large that will destroy value. So what they will do in this case, they will merge, they will share data but the data provided by the data broker 1 will be thrown away. So the maximum price that they can set together is the price that equals the value of the most valuable data set, which is equal in this case to f lambda 2. So the mechanism is very simple. I'm sharing data with you, but I realize that if I'm merging the two data sets, I will lose value. So let's agree to share data, but I'm not selling your data to the buyer. And we agree to set a price equal to the maximum value that our data sets provide, which in this case is equal to f lambda 2. And therefore, the joint profits under sharing will be equal to f lambda 2. So let us consider now the individual the incentive to share or not to share data when we move from the two sub-games to the first stage of the game, when there is a decision on whether to share data or not. Now, in a very simple way, let's try to understand when there are incentives, there is a possibility to share data. And the first things that we can do is to look at whether the joint profits under sharing are larger than the joint profits under competition. If joint profits under competition are larger than under sharing, it is automatic that there is no incentive at all to share data. So first of all, let's try to look at whether there is a potential for sharing data. And we can see that if the buyer is more inefficient than the data brokers in merging data, there is a possibility to share data, because together they can do better. They can extract more surplus as compared to a situation in which there is competition. However, when you have an upstream, you have the data brokers that to some extent are more inefficient than the buyer in handling data. And remember, this can feature the case in which you have Facebook acquiring data from data brokers, Axiom and Datalogic, for instance. You can see that for sure, data sharing will not arise in this area here. Data sharing will not arise when you have a super additive data structure, because competition in this case will lead to a multiplicity of equilibrium in which they are able to extract everything rather than incurring in this merging cost C. But you may also be willing to not to share data and compete in the market when the data structure is subadditive, but only for some dimensions. Now, with this in mind, we can move to the individual incentive to share data. So, and these are the sufficient condition. So these are the necessary conditions for sharing to arise when you have joint profits under sharing larger than joint profits under competition. We can now see on whether individually data brokers will prefer to share data or not. Now, let's start from the case in which you have an ex-post super additive data structure. Again, this represents the case in which you have complementarities. And under competition, there is a multiplicity of equilibria. And in this multiplicity of equilibrium, they are able to extract all the surplus from the buyer, but they need to discount the merging cost occurring downstream. And now, to verify whether individual profits under sharing are larger than individual profits under competition, we need to compare all the possible equilibrium under competition to the unique equilibrium under sharing. And for simplicity, let's say that under competition, this surplus can be allocated according to these shares, alpha and 1 minus alpha. To some extent, with this alpha, we can map all the potential combination of equilibrium that arise under competition. And we can see that data sharing will arise if this value, the net value of the merged data set at the upstream level, is larger than this component here. Now, there are two things that we can see here. First of all, and this also relates to the previous graph, if C is larger than CB, so the upstream, the data brokers are more inefficient than the buyer, this condition will be never satisfied. So data brokers will prefer to share, to compete in the market. Because by competing, they can individually do better than under sharing. Now suppose that C is smaller than CB. So you have a downstream inefficiency. You are selling data to a supermarket. Is there a possibility for sharing to emerge? It depends. It depends on whether this condition is satisfied, and this condition is almost never satisfied. Because as soon as you increase alpha, which is the share of profits that you would get under competition, if one data broker is increasing profits, the other data broker is reducing profits because the surplus that they can make together remain fixed. And this implies that if one data broker has an incentive to enter into the sharing agreement, the other data broker might have an incentive to veto that sharing agreement. And in particular, we can see that sharing would arise only in some rare cases. So when there is a superadditive, when there is a superadditive data structure, when there are complementarities, it is more likely the case that data brokers will prefer to compete in the market rather than to share data. Let us consider now when the data structure is EPoS subadditive. So if you merge data set, you end up destroying some value, but this destruction of value is not very large because you have either intermediate or medium merging costs, or because there is already an overlap between data sets. And we show here that sharing will occur if and only if this condition is satisfied. And this condition is always satisfied when there is a downstream inefficiency, when you are selling to a supermarket rather than to Facebook. And the reason is that you want to share data because you can do better together, extracting all the surplus by sharing rather than competing in the market and granting a discount for this inefficient merging cost occurring downstream. So they will internalize this downstream inefficiency and they will do better by sharing data. At the same time, by sharing data, they will not need to discount for the extent of the overlap existing between data sets. On the contrary, if there is an upstream inefficiency, you are selling data to Facebook, for instance, then it is not always the case. You might have some areas in which you prefer to share data, which are the areas arising when merging costs are very large or the overlapping component is very large. And instead, you will prefer to compete in the market when these merging costs are not very large or the degree of overlap is not so strong. Finally, let us consider the case in which you have an extreme subadditive data structure. Remember, in this scenario, data broker 2 can enter into an agreement with data broker 1 under the condition that only data broker 2's data are sold and data broker 1 data are thrown away. And if this is the case, they will always have an incentive to share because, of course, they will soften the competition. Data broker 1 will prefer to join the sharing agreement because under competition, data broker 1 gets nothing. And data broker 2 will prefer to join the sharing agreement because under sharing will have higher profits than under competition. But however, this result strongly depends on the fact that you can throw away data. But what if you cannot throw away data? So for instance, suppose that you commit to share data with another data broker, and then you need to incur this merging cost. You share data, you cannot strategically have this sort of collusive agreement in which you share data, but only fictionally, and then you sell data to the buyer as this data were coming from a real sharing agreement. If this is the case, then sharing will arise only in some condition, when these conditions here are respected. And this implies that this incentive to share data are non-monotonic in the data structure. In some cases, you may have competition. In some other cases, you may have a sharing agreement. And to wrap up, you can have a look at this graph that nicely summarizes all the cases that we've been analyzing so far. Suppose, first of all, that you have a downstream efficiency as compared to the data broker. So imagine that the buyer's merging costs are smaller than the data broker's merging costs. Again, the situation in which data brokers are selling data to Facebook. In this case, you will have an incentive to share data only when you have a very strong substitutability. In all other cases, you will prefer to compete in the market. But when this is not the case, and data brokers are better in handling data than the buyer, you have these three cases here. And what these cases tell us is that when you have an extreme subadditive data structure or a subadditive data structure, as a data broker, you can, it is better for you to share data with your rival, because this way you can soften competition, you can avoid granting a discount, accounting for the downstream inefficient merging cost, and you can avoid destroying data. On the other hand, in this area here, when you have a superadditive data structure, your incentive to share or to compete in the market will depend on which equilibrium out of the multiple equilibria that you have under competition you are selecting. So if you are selecting the equilibria that are the most asymmetric one data broker is getting only its own intrinsic value, and the other data broker is getting the full net marginal contribution to the merged data set, you are selecting the most asymmetric equilibrium. And indeed, you will have always this data broker not willing to compete, but willing to share data, and this other data broker not willing to share data and getting something smaller in terms of returns. And indeed, you will have a veto. And this situation will occur in this area here when you have a very large asymmetry in the merging cost between the buyer and the data brokers, or when you have alpha, which is a parameter considering the shares of profits going to data brokers in the multiple equilibrium that is more or less equal to half. So you can see here that you have some non-monotonicity in the incentive to share or compete in the market. And this non-monotonicity becomes stronger when you cannot have the strategic sharing agreement in which data broker 2 is sharing data with data broker 1, but with the condition of not using data broker 1 data, because using that data will destroy some value. So you can see you have a non-monotonicity of the incentives to compete or to share data in the market. We can also show, and I'm approaching to the conclusion, that these results are also robust to a setting in which you have sequential moves. These sequential moves can be sequential pricing. So it implies that there is one data broker that is moving as a market leader, and you have another data broker that is moving as a market follower. And you can see here that you may have a fewer incentive to share data, because one data broker can avoid granting a discount if you have subadditivity. Or when you have a superadditivity, you will have a unique equilibrium. So you will be able to have a selection, an equilibrium selection of one equilibrium out of the many equilibria that you have under competition. And the equilibrium that you will be selecting is the most asymmetric one. And the most asymmetric one is also the one in which one data broker has more incentive to veto any sharing agreement. So you will have less sharing going on when you have sequential prices. And we can also see what happens when you have sequential data selling, When you have sequential data selling, you may imagine a situation in which one data broker has already sold data to a buyer, and the buyer now needs to decide whether he wants to buy data also from the other data broker. And in this case, what is interesting is that you may have a second mover advantage when data structure is super additive, because the second mover can grab all the externalities that two data sets, when merged, can create together. But you may have a first mover advantage when you have a subadditive data structure or an extreme subadditive data structure. This is to say that with this paper, we try to provide a quite simple and general model in which you have competition, but also co-opetition between data brokers selling a very special product, which is data, that has a contextual value that requires sometimes very large merging costs, and these merging costs can differ according to the actor that is actually merging the data sets. And we find that the incentive to share data may not be maybe non-monotonic in the value of the merged data set, but this depends also on the merging costs and on whether you may have the possibility to have this strategic move of throwing away your rival data if merging costs are sufficiently large. And data sharing arises as a way to soften market competition and to avoid granting a discount to the buyer in case you have downstream inefficiency. And finally, very quickly on the policy implications, we can see that so far most of the literature is mainly focused on privacy and individual rights, and there has been less attention devoted to the anti-competitive nature of data trading. And what we can see in this paper is that while we do not model the consumer dimension, we can see that you might have some inefficiency going on in terms of reallocation of surplus between buyers and data brokers. And this is something that authorities may be worried about. And in terms of empirical implication, it would be interesting to see whether to some extent the pro-competitive whether the GDPR created some pro-competitive effects in this market for data in which you have intermediate but shady players like data brokers, of which we do not know much about. So that's all. Thank you very much for your attention. Thanks to the organizer for organizing this seminar series and for hosting today's seminar. And I'm really looking forward for comments and suggestions. These suggestions are very useful at this stage because we are still working on this paper. Thank you very much.